we are joined by Andreas Kyriakos. He's with the G7 Research Group, and he's also an expert on trade. So I want to ask you, Trump making these comments about Russia, is this just a distraction from the whole trade issue here? I mean, what would a G8 look like with Russia coming back?
So if we know anything about Trump, we know that he's predictably unpredictable. So in terms of this potentially being a distraction, maybe. Will it distract the other leaders from their main priority, which is figuring out this whole quagmire of trade? Let's hope not. In terms of Russia joining, as you said, there does not seem to be a very high chance. So Conte, the new Italian prime minister, has come out supporting it, but everyone else is aligned against. It's actually interesting. Trump said yesterday about Russia that we have been Russia's biggest nightmare, quote unquote, or he has rather. So it's an interesting thing to watch, but I really do think trade will be number one on the agenda.
So speaking of trade, just before Trump got on Marine One, he talked about the idea of scrapping NAFTA. He said at the same time that he hopes to come here to Canada to come to an agreement with G7 leaders. At the same time, he said that he's okay with not signing any sort of agreement after this summit. What's a realistic outcome once the G7 closes?
Well, so this summit will probably be different from a lot of other summits we've seen before. In terms of NAFTA, this is a narrative that we've been watching for essentially since when Trump entered office, especially as we're based, our research group is based in Canada, so we have a very close eye on the NAFTA talks. I mean, the idea of the agreement being negotiated bilaterally between Canada and the U.S., and Mexico, and Canada has been floated, but the Canadians have come out completely against it. I don't really see that happening. But you know, with all of these things, you put a play out there, hope it will stick, and then see how your negotiating partners react. So I suspect a lot of this is tactics, as we know. Also, it's notable that Trump is leaving early. He's leaving the summit tomorrow morning at 10:30, so pretty much before day 2 kicks off. So there is a hope that there would be more alignment on some of this stuff tomorrow in terms of a plastics charter, for example, since trade is so clearly an issue with very little agreement, but it seems like he also won't be there for that.
European leaders have made a point to say that it's very important for them at this point in the face of all this adversity to come together as a group. Is it realistic to think that the G7 can move forward without the world's greatest superpower?
Well, so President Macron of France did say yesterday that the idea of a G6+1 communique was completely in the cards. It's also really been interesting to watch how Macron had been courting Trump, as we've seen, for such a long time, and perhaps has now realized that that's no longer useful for him or for France, so has changed his tune. So he talked about this idea of crude hegemony, and how the United States was trying to be a hegemon still, and how the other powers were strong enough and had enough economic clout that they could unite against the United States and achieve something together. So it's totally possible. In terms of the communique, as you mentioned, that's usually the main outcome of a summit, and it's consensus-based, of course, right? So the option, if it's not a 6+1 communique with the United States on the sidelines, would be a communique probably without much substance. And given that this is Prime Minister Trudeau's first major international event he's hosting, that would not be considered a successful outcome. I think for him, he would not consider that successful, since he does think of himself as this progressive leader right now in a world where there isn't much progressive thinking. So I think that a 6+1 outcome with some substantive clauses is probably pretty likely.
Well, certainly a lot riding on all of this. Andreas Kyriakos, thank you so much for that. President Trump set to arrive in Canada potentially within the next hour. That means he won't even be here for 24 hours. During that time, he will have 2 bilateral meetings, one with the UK and one, of course, with Justin Trudeau of Canada. He will leave the summit on Saturday ahead of the discussion surrounding climate change, a topic that we know President Trump is not necessarily too interested in. And he's leaving early, of course, to make that big meeting next week that he is having with Kim Jong-un in Singapore, Aisha.